Welcome back. We can definitely start with panel one, historical interdependencies among maritime cities in Asia. I invite Professor David Abulafia to chair this session and to invite the speakers on stage, please.
Well, good morning again, and it's a great pleasure to be able to chair a session here. And we have two speakers today in my session, and the first of them is Professor Chong Guan, who is Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, and among his latest publications is an edited volume, Early Southeast Asia Viewed from India, an anthology of articles from the Journal of the Greater Indian Society. So, Professor Kwa, please. Thank you very much.
Well, let me say that I'm humbled and awed by this honor to be the first speaker at this first session, and to be following Professor Abulafia. And that what I want to say is actually following his footsteps just now on the historiography of the sea, and in a sense then adding a few footnotes. So I must thank Professor Andre for inviting me to this. We discussed this some months ago, and as I understand it, my mandate or my mission here is to propose the idea of a Maritime Silk Road as a framework to think about our maritime heritage and how this idea of a Maritime Silk Road can help us to understand the rise and fall of maritime hubs, port cities in the Indian Ocean and South China Sea, which, as you can see, is the theme of our gathering here. What I would say is nothing new. I'm just merely drawing together ideas that you may be familiar with into, I hope, a coherent story about the history of the writing of that Maritime Silk Road, which starts with this German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, who was primarily interested in the geography of China, and he was looking at it from its borders in Central Asia, and how do we know about China from that perspective. And he looked at Europe, he looked at Roman Europe, and he saw the idea of silk as the underlying link and theme between China and Rome. So he was in that early generation of those who was looking at that Central Asian mass there. Von Richthofen still never visited the place. It was his students, say Ferdinand, who went off to actually trace out what he was learning from his mentor, his student, his teacher. And in a series of epic journeys, he actually traced the outlines of that route and was followed by others like Arul Stein and Paul Pelliot. You see here this classic photo of the French sinologist Pelliot examining the manuscripts in the Cave 17 at Dunhuang, and together with Arul Stein earlier had carted off some of the key piles of the manuscript back to London and to Paris. So this is then the idea of a Maritime Silk Road as von Richthofen was working towards, which he saw as only covering the era of the Han and the Roman Empire and their links with each other. But the idea has caught on, the idea of a link between Europe and China caught on, and so you get this romanticization of that link in the Peking to Paris Motor Challenge, first run in 1907, and now we are seeing a revival of it next year. And so those of you who have got the funding support to do it, I think you can still sign up. Then, of course, at the other end, you have got Kintaro and Yo-Yo Ma also propounding the romanticism of this overland Silk route. Von Richthofen, however, was aware that there were also links between China and Rome by sea, and he should know that he was the chairman of the German Maritime Society. So he was aware of the point that Professor Abulafia made up, that the sea is actually more important in that it transports more things. And here, the issue of how many camels would have been needed to carry the Tang Dynasty cargo if there was no sea route. My colleague worked it out. 220 Bactrian camels would be needed to carry the 25 tons of ceramics across. And I don't think any oasis town on the Silk Road could have sustained a caravan of 220 Bactrian camels. So this was the route that von Richthofen was working towards, and in his idea, it was Roman demand for Chinese silk that provided the incentive for trading across the Indian Ocean. And for those of you from that part of the world, you would recognize where that photo comes from. The consequence of this for our part of the world was that the European scholars, archaeologists, historians, who were looking at the historical monuments in their colonies, Angkor, Cambodia, Java, trying to make sense of it, they saw that idea of Roman incentives for, or demand for silk, as the incentive that brought the Indian trade and colonization, and I should put the word colonization there in quotes, across the Bay of Bengal to inspire the creation of these monuments that you see the early drawings of Borobudur and Angkor Wat. And the scholars of the French Far East School, the École Française Extrême-Orient, the founding members there were key in this idea of links, how the links between India and Southeast Asia across the Bay of Bengal developed. So, the knowledge that this group of French, Dutch, European scholars were accumulating to explain how the Borobudur, how Angkor, Pagan came about as a consequence of Indian trade, Indian colonization, was taken up by a group of Indian historians in the 1920s in Bengal and developed into a theory, vision of an Indian colonization of Southeast Asia in a pre-colonial era. They were then, of course, writing a very nationalist history of India in which these Indianized monuments were creating a vision of an Indian cultural empire. And then here you see a classic photo of Tagore, who was the guru of that group, and on his famous 1927 visit to Borobudur, to Bali, where he made the remark to the effect that I see India everywhere and yet I don't recognize it, to show the extent of how different we in the region had appropriated and localized Hinduism or Hindu beliefs. But that idea of a Hindu, of an Indianized trade across the Bay of Bengal continues today, where you have in Bengal, in Orissa, a massive trade fair every November that celebrates this supposed voyage across the Indian Ocean to Bali. The key word there is Bali Yantra, which comes from an inscription that supposedly refers to these voyages that is now being reconstructed or recreated and reenacted every year. I believe our colleague here, Herman Kulke, he assures me that Bali Yantra doesn't refer to that Bali. It simply refers to a spot on the river where the victorious king rested and had his bath. The other end of the Silk Road, as we understand it now, was of course the lure of the Chinese market. that it was the Han that was providing these silks, and in return demanding aromatas and exoticas. One remembers here Qin Shi Huangdi's search for the elixirs of life, and the beginnings of that Han Chinese expeditions into the South China Sea, and the Tang market, which Professor Wang Ganggu has documented so well in his master's thesis of 1955. And then we go on to the Song as a major capitalist economy with great demands for goods from the South Seas because they lost the control of the overland route. We are looking at Ming consumption and Qing dependence on maritime trade. The Qing were not an inward-looking empire regime as conventional wisdom has it here. So that's our understanding of the Maritime Silk Road as it was conceived in the first half of the 20th century. But after World War II, we get a new generation of scholars, of new evidences coming up from archaeological evidence. The rereading the old text really leads to an interrogation of the old assumptions and reconstructions. So we now recognize that the Silk Route did not begin with Greco-Egyptian traders crossing the Arabian Sea to find the spices and silks that were in demand in the Roman West, but actually had prehistoric beginnings. One route ran overland from Thailand into northern India. But more important for us would be the increasing evidence of Austronesian or Southeast Asian seafaring that were linking the emerging chiefdoms in Southeast Asia, the emerging chiefdoms that became the ports and emporiums of the later centuries there. And so here you see the example of that we all look at, the ship on the Borobudur and its reconstruction sailing across the Bay of Bengal there. And I assume my colleague John Nixick will be talking about these links of these ports in those circles there. But I think the impetus to the Silk Route as we understand it today was between the 4th and the 10th century when Buddhism became a major force that provided the framework for the Silk Road, and with Sriwijaya as the emporium. Buddhism was expanding both overland to China and across the sea. And I believe one of our presentations on tomorrow will be talking about a major maritime documentation project there. So I look forward to hearing more of that tomorrow and will not say more of it here now. Concurrent with the Buddhist trading world and Buddhism as the framework for a trading world was an Indo-Islamic trading world from the 7th to the 17th century with the rise of Islam as a major global power and going into the early modern era with the three great empires of the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals there. So the evidence now, I think, shows that the Arabs and the Persians were active traders from the 7th century onwards. The ships that crossing the Maritime Silk Road were Arab dhows, and you see there a photo of the recreation of the ship that you will see this evening hanging in that Maritime Museum on Sentosa. Within that period, you have the emergence of China as a major maritime power from the time of the Southern Song, when they were a capitalist economy, they had the consumption power, they were demanding lots of new items of trade, of consumption, of luxuries, and they didn't have access to the overland route. So it was with the Song that you see this turn to the ocean, and continued during the Yuan when they invaded Southeast Asia and Japan, and you see there a Japanese recreation of that invasion. And of course, we are familiar with the voyages of the Yunnan Admiral Zheng He, and I put down there the photograph of the giraffe that was brought back as a great treasure, and 2 images of Zheng He. I'll leave you to decide which one portrays him better as a eunuch, that tall, muscular figure, or that little man there. And of course, the issue then whether the ships that he sailed compared to the little one of what Vasco da Gama was sailing in was an architectural feasibility. I think John and I have attended more than one conference on this issue of the naval architecture possibility of building a ship in timber of that size. Vasco da Gama coming was supposed to bring an end to this great Maritime Silk Road and the new era of domination by the Europeans, which ended 1945. But I think we are now realizing that actually, as our colleague Anthony Reid has documented, it was actually an age of commerce, an age of prosperity in Southeast Asia that continued into 1680, and literally it was a period where Asian traders, Asian trade networks held up their own way into the 18th or 19th century, arguably. Archaeology has also provided us new perspectives to understand the Silk Road, the ships, the types of ships that were sailing, the Arab dhows, the Indian ships, and most important, we are now recognizing the absence of Chinese sailing on that route until the time of the Song, if not later. So, the Borobudur ship, the recreation of that ship sailing, the Arab dhow that brought the Tang cargo, and we recognize that Chinese naval technology was there, but it was more of a coastal shipping. They didn't have the deep-keel boats to venture into blue waters, and that was the cause of Kublai Khan's disaster. His ships couldn't take the open seas crossing to Japan, and it was really not until the Ming that we get these hybrid ships there. So, in summary, we now recognize that the Silk Road was not, as von Richthofen and an earlier generation of historians recognize, starting with Roman demand for silk and spices that provided incentive for Indian traders to come to Southeast Asia and onwards to China, but really it was earlier prehistoric connections that became the basis of Asian networks across the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the South China Sea. And these were consolidated in a Pan-Asian Buddhist world and an Indo-Islamic trading world, in which China was a maritime power during that period from 1127 to 1433, when the voyages of Zheng He ended there. But China was a major maritime economy in that it continued to provide the market that drove the Silk Route. And then, arguably, I would say, the European merchant empires, colonialism, was a continuation of that. The Silk Route did not end with Vasco da Gama, as some historians have argued here. And finally, let me come down to how this idea of a maritime Silk Route has been used and appropriated by others today. And this is where my take into this issue came here. And I will come back to it here. So we have in 1988, UNESCO starting a major research project on the Silk Road. And it went on for 10 years. The project was primarily focused on the overland Silk Route, and of course UNESCO was using that to promote its vision of dialogues, of diversity, of connections between civilizations, and today that project continues in a number of initiatives to develop tourism, heritage on that overland maritime Silk Route. Xi Jinping, Chinese President Xi Jinping, however, come out with a different set of appropriations of this idea of a maritime Silk Route in 2013 in Indonesia, and has been promoting this idea of one Silk Road, one belt, and across Central Asia, and a maritime Silk Road as his major foreign policy initiatives to restructure Eurasian geoeconomics and geopolitics. And quite clearly, Xi is here drawing on historical metaphors, very powerful historical metaphors for political goals. And you can see this very clearly in how Chinese media is projecting this Silk Road. Hints of Kintaro and Yo-Yo Ma are all coming through in these posters here. And for the Indians, hey, wait. This is not what we recognize. You Chinese were not really there. So they have responded with a Project Mausam to answer to China's maritime might. And so far, this project has been confined to inviting a number of key speakers from the Indira Gandhi Center, the Archaeological Service India, to do talks to re-establish India's premium position as the initiator of these old networks. And where I come in is that my Indian colleagues in my other life as a strategic analyst have then invited me to India. We got to do something about these Chinese initiatives. And I said, no, look. If you look at the history of the Silk Road, both of you are wrong. And of course, neither side likes me very much for that. So, the conclusions I'm coming to is that we have today then what I would say is a UNESCO vision of the Silk Roads, both overland and the sea, as roads of dialogue, cultural interactions, arising from all these encounters between East and West. So, but then on the other hand, you have emerging this Chinese vision of connectivities, of them providing all this funding to re-establish a new Silk Road that would establish China's preeminence in this part of the world, at least on the southern, in the Indian Ocean, in the South China Sea, and into the Bay of Bengal, much to the unhappiness of our Indian colleagues. And so that Chinese vision leaves us in Southeast Asia with a very practical problem of how do we respond to these Chinese initiatives? Do we accept it? And the consequences of being drawn closer and closer into a Chinese cultural, economic, historical sphere. You can look at it here, that slew of agreements that we have just signed, Singapore just signed during Xi's visit. Does that, as my colleague says, do well for Singapore? But what are the implications for our foreign policy initiatives? Does it draw us closer and closer to China here? And of course, India is reacting adversely to these Chinese initiatives into the Indian Ocean, which they see as their ocean, and are trying to re-establish that they are the preeminent power there, and the Chinese have got no right to be there. And of course, where does that leave us in Southeast Asia? Well, as John and I would say, we are trying to position Southeast Asia not as the gatekeeper, because they alarm both the Chinese and Indian, but I think as the facilitator, the enabler of the Silk Road, that the Straits of Malacca actually was the key channel through which the links between the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal went. Sriwijaya and all those ports that John talked about were actually then shaping the forming of that Silk Road. So, on that note, I will end and leave you with these three thoughts of where is then this maritime Silk Road. It is not history, I would argue, that museum curators can happily talk about in abstract in their galleries, displaying the town cargo, but it's a very real problem for us that whether it's a road that talks about connecting people, technologies, as we are going to see in the Asian Civilization Museum, as I understand from my colleague sitting there, or whether it's a real problem of this South China Sea, Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea, as highly contested geo-economic and geopolitical spaces here. And this is where I get my living these days, talking about these issues of the PLA defending China's 9 dotted lines in the South China Sea. Or are we going to be open enough to accept that the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea are public goods, resources, global commons that we can rationally share out and jointly develop? I think that's the challenge facing us today when we look at this new Maritime Silk Road. And I've taken 25 minutes and 15 seconds, a bit less than my 30. Yeah. I have a clock here that tells me exactly how many seconds I got left.